My name is Mia, and I'm 29 years old. 3 years ago, my mother called me 4 days before Thanksgiving and said 6 words that shattered everything. I thought I knew about family, love, and belonging. There isn't enough room this year. The silence that followed those words was heavy, thick with the scent of the cinnamon broom I'd just bought to make my apartment feel like a home. I was standing in my small kitchen, a bag of groceries on the counter, extra heavy cream for the mashed potatoes everyone loved, the expensive vanilla beans for the cranberry sauce I spent hours perfecting. "What do you mean, Mom?" I asked. My voice sounded small, even to me. I hated that. I hated how I immediately shrank the moment she spoke. "Well," Linda said, her voice breezy, the way it always was when she was about to deliver a blow. "Victoria and her husband are bringing his parents this year. And with the kids getting older, we're tight on space. We've decided to keep it to the core family and their immediate in-laws. It's just easier, Mia. You understand, don't you? You're so good at being flexible." Flexible? That was the word they used for me. Like I was a piece of clay they could mold and stretch and squeeze into whatever corner was left over. "I am the core family," I said. My heart was starting to thud against my ribs, a dull, rhythmic ache. "I'm your daughter." "Of course you are, honey. Don't be dramatic," she sighed. And I could practically see her rolling her eyes, checking her watch, wondering when this inconvenient conversation would be over. "We'll do something just us, maybe in January. When things settle down. It'll be better that way. More one-on-one time." She said one-on-one time, the way you promise a toddler a sticker for not crying. "Is Dad there?" I asked. "He's in the garage working on that birdhouse. You know how he gets. Anyway, I have to go. The florist is on the other line, and I need to confirm the centerpieces. Victoria wants everything to be white and gold this year." "Very elegant." The line clicked. I stood there for a long time, the phone still pressed to my ear until it went cold against my skin. Outside my window, the Chicago wind was whipping through the alley, carrying the faint metallic smell of impending snow. Inside, the radiator hissed and clanked, a lonely, mechanical sound that seemed to mock the festive. Bags of food on my counter. I looked at the heavy cream. I looked at the vanilla beans. I thought about the core family. My sister Victoria, the golden child whose life was a curated gallery of perfection. Her husband, the corporate lawyer. Their 2 children, who were the only grandchildren my parents seemed to acknowledge. And now, even her in-laws had a seat at a table that apparently had no room for me. Walked over to the trash can. I didn't cry, not yet. I just picked up the bag of expensive cranberries and dropped them in. Thud. Then the cream. Splash. I felt like I was disappearing. It wasn't just this one dinner. It was the way my mother never remembered my birthday until Victoria posted about it on Instagram. It was the way my father looked at the floor whenever I tried to tell him about my new job as a freelance graphic designer, as if my success was a language he didn't care to learn. I was the extra, the person who filled the gap in photos, the one who was expected to bring the best side dish but stay out of the conversation. I was the acceptable sacrifice. I went to my living room and sat on the floor. I didn't turn on the lights. I just watched the blue-gray twilight bleed into the room. I felt a strange, hollow sensation in my chest, not the sharp sting of a fresh wound, but the dull, heavy realization that the floor I'd been standing on my whole life was actually a trapdoor, and my mother had just pulled the lever. I thought about my father's birdhouses. He built them with such care, sanding the wood until it was smooth as silk, painting them bright, welcoming colors. He built homes for creatures that would stay for a season and then fly away. But he couldn't seem to find the courage to keep a seat for his own daughter. My phone buzzed on the floor next to me. A text from the family group chat, Victoria. "So excited for Thursday. The menu looks amazing, Mom. It's going to be the perfect little circle." "Mom, only the best for my favorites." I stared at the screen. The perfect little circle. A circle is a closed loop. It has no beginning and no end, but most importantly, it has no way in if you're standing on the outside. Something inside me went quiet. Not sad, not angry, just empty. It was a terrifying kind of stillness. I realized then that I had spent 30 years trying to force my way into a circle that was designed to keep me out. I had spent my life apologizing for taking up space, only to find out that I didn't actually have any space to begin with. I stood up, my knees cracking in the silence of the dark apartment. I walked to the window and looked out at the streetlights flickering on. The world was moving forward. People were rushing home to their families, clutching bottles of wine and bundles of firewood. But as the darkness settled in, Something else settled too. A quiet decision I didn't even fully understand yet. A decision that this would be the last time I ever asked for a seat at a table where I wasn't wanted. The decision felt like a cold stone in my stomach. It wasn't the fiery defiance you see in movies. It was a heavy, weary realization. I spent that first night drifting through the rooms of my apartment, my mind acting like a projector, playing back a highlight reel of every time I had been edited out of my own life. I realized that the Thanksgiving phone call wasn't an isolated incident. It was the closing argument of a 30-year-old trial I had already lost. Remembered being 7, it was Victoria's dance recital. I had a fever. My throat felt like I'd swallowed broken glass. But my mother had hissed at me in the car. "Don't you dare ruin this for your sister with your whining." I sat in the velvet seat of the auditorium shivering, the smell of hairspray and old floor wax making me dizzy, watching Victoria twirl in pink tulle. My mother's eyes were shining, her hands clapping until they were red. When it was my turn for a school play 3 months later, my mother forgot the date because Victoria had a fitting for her pageant dress. "You're so independent, Mia," my father had told me when he found me sitting on the porch steps, waiting for a ride that never came. "You don't need the fuss like she does." It was a compliment that felt like a life sentence. Sat at my desk and pulled out an old photo album I kept in the bottom drawer, hidden under tax returns and freelance contracts. I flipped the pages, the plastic crinkling under my fingers. There we were at the beach when I was 12. Victoria is in the center, laughing, ice cream dripping down her chin. My mother is looking at her, beaming. My father is looking at the camera. And there I am on the very edge of the frame, half my body cut off by the person who took the photo, always on the periphery, always the shadow in the background of someone else's light. I thought about the Christmas when I was 23. I had saved for months to buy my father a vintage watch he'd mentioned once in passing. I was so proud when he opened it. He looked at it, mumbled a "thanks, kiddo," and set it aside. 5 minutes later, Victoria gave him a generic Best Dad mug she'd clearly picked up at a gas station on the way over, and he teared up, hugging her like she'd handed him the keys to the kingdom. Remembered the taste of the cold coffee I'd been drinking that morning, the bitterness coating my tongue. It was the same bitterness I felt now. Why am I never enough? I whispered to the empty room. I reached out to my father that night, a last-ditch effort to find a tether. I called his private line in the garage, the one my mother didn't monitor. The phone rang 4 times before he picked up. I could hear the rhythmic scritch-scritch of sandpaper against wood. "Hey, Dad," I said, trying to keep my voice level. "Oh, hey, Mia." "Don't do this, Mia. Don't make it difficult. You know how your mother gets when things aren't perfect. Let's just have a quiet lunch in January, okay? I'll buy you that steak you like." "I don't want a steak in January, Dad. I want to be part of the family in November." "Mia," he said, and I could hear the warning in his tone. "Life isn't always fair. Sometimes you have to take one for the team." The team. A team I was never allowed to play on, but was always expected to cheer for from the sidelines. I've been taking one for the team for 30 years. "Dad, when is it my turn to be on the team?" "I have to go," he said abruptly. "The glue is setting on this roof. We'll talk later." He hung up. The sound of the dial tone was like a heart monitor flatlining. I stared at my phone. My father had a chance to choose me. He had 1,000 chances over the years to stand up, to speak my name, to pull me into the light. And every single time, he chose silence instead. He chose the easy path of my mother's approval over the difficult path of his daughter's heart. Realize then that grief isn't just about losing someone who died. It's about losing the version of people you hoped they would be. I was grieving a father who never existed and a mother who saw me as a flaw in her perfect tapestry. Went to the bathroom and splashed cold water on my face. The mirror showed a woman with dark circles under her eyes and a trembling lip. But there was something else there too. A flicker of something hard. Something sharp. I walked back to the kitchen and looked at the trash. Where I'd thrown the food. I realized I wasn't just throwing away groceries. I was throwing away the hope that they would ever change. I was throwing away the flexible Mia who would accept a January steak as a substitute for love. Sat in my apartment as the sun went down, watching the shadows stretch across my floor. The radiator hissed again, but this time it didn't feel like a mock. It felt like a countdown. I was alone. Truly, deeply alone in a city of millions, 4 days before a holiday designed for togetherness. But for the first time in my life, the silence didn't feel like a vacuum. It felt like a clean slate. "Everything okay?" He sounded distracted. I could picture him. glasses perched on the tip of his nose, sawdust coating his flannel shirt. Mom told me about Thanksgiving. About the space. The sandpapering stopped. The silence on the other end was deafening. I waited for him to say he'd fix it. I waited for him to say he'd pull up a folding chair, or that he'd tell Mom it was ridiculous to exclude their daughter. I waited for him to be the father I saw in the movies, the one who protects his own. It's just a busy year. Mia, he said finally, his voice flat, devoid of the warmth he used for everyone else. Your mother has put a lot of work into the planning. Victoria's in-laws are, well, they're very formal people. It's important to your sister. And what about me, Dad? Is it important to you that I'm there? I heard him sigh. It was a heavy, burdened sound, as if my very existence was a chore he was tired of performing. The morning of Thanksgiving arrived with a sky the color of a bruised plum. I woke up to the sound of sleet tapping against my bedroom window. A rhythmic, lonely, metallic sound. Usually on this day, I would be a whirlwind of anxiety, ironing my best dress, checking the temperature of the oven, and rehearsing my happy face so I wouldn't be accused of being too sensitive during dinner. But this year, the apartment was silent. There was no turkey in the fridge, no scent of sage or roasting onions, just the smell of the bitter black coffee I was clutching in my shaking hands. I made the mistake of checking my phone. The family group chat was a parade of joy. Victoria had posted a photo of the table. It was breathtaking, white linen, gold-rimmed plates, and a centerpiece of white roses and gilded pumpkins that probably cost more than my monthly rent. My mother was tagged in a photo holding a glass of champagne, her face glowing in the candlelight. The caption read, "Nothing matters more than the ones who are always there. So grateful for my core family. Blessed tradition." I was the daughter who lived 40 minutes away, and I was being treated like a ghost. I stared at the photo until my vision blurred. I looked at the empty chair next to my father, where Victoria's mother-in-law sat smiling. That was my place. That was where I belonged. I felt a wave of nausea so strong I had to set my coffee down. It wasn't just the exclusion. It was the erasure. They weren't just having dinner without me. They were performing a version of our family where I didn't exist at all. I looked at my kitchen table. It was covered in sketches for a freelance logo I was working on. One plate, one fork, one napkin. The weight of it finally broke me. I collapsed into my kitchen chair and sobbed. Not the pretty, quiet crying you see in movies, but the ugly, gut-wrenching kind that makes your ribs ache and your lungs burn. I cried for the 7-year-old at the dance recital. I cried for the 23-year-old with the vintage watch. I cried for the woman sitting in a dark apartment in Chicago, while her core family toasted to a circle that had no room for her. I felt the rock bottom. It was cold and hard and incredibly quiet. Around 3 p.m., the hunger hit, not just emotional, but physical. My stomach felt hollow, a cavern of emptiness. I looked in my pantry. A half-empty box of pasta. A jar of peanut butter. I couldn't do it. I couldn't sit here and eat dry toast while they were carving a turkey. I wasn't allowed to taste. "No," I whispered. My voice was hoarse from crying. "I am not doing this." I stood up and went to the bathroom. My face was a disaster, eyes swollen, nose red. I washed my face with freezing water until my skin tingled. I put on a thick, oversized wool sweater, my warmest boots, and a coat I usually saved for important meetings. I did my makeup with trembling fingers, layering on enough concealer to hide the grief. The streets were eerily empty. Most storefronts were dark, their closed for holiday signs feeling like personal rejections. The sleet had turned into a wet, heavy snow that clung to my eyelashes and chilled me to the bone. I walked for 6 blocks, my boots crunching on the salted pavement. Every window I passed seemed to glow with amber light. I could hear the muffled sounds of laughter, the clinking of silverware, the generic hum of football games on television. Every house was a fortress of belonging, and I was a scout in the wilderness. I reached a small, local bistro called The Hearth. It was a place I'd passed 100 times but never entered. It always looked too cozy, too intimate, like a place you only go if you have someone to hold hands with across the table. The open sign was flickering in the window, a small neon heartbeat in the gray afternoon. I pushed the door open. The heat hit me first, smelling of wood smoke, roasted garlic, and something sweet like mulled cider. The sound of soft jazz was playing, barely audible over the low murmur of a few occupied tables. A woman at the host stand looked up. She was older, with silver hair tied back in a loose bun and eyes that seemed to see right through my carefully applied concealer. "Just one?" she asked, her voice like warm honey. The question usually made me flinch. "Just one, only one. Always one." "Yes," I said, my voice cracking slightly. "Just me." She didn't pity me. She didn't give me that head tilt of sympathy that makes you want to scream. She just picked up a menu, smiled, and led me to a small, circular table right by the fireplace. "This is the best seat in the house," she whispered, pulling out the chair for me. "The fire keeps the chill out of your soul." I sat down, my frozen hands beginning to throb as they thawed. I grabbed my coat and clutched it in my lap like a shield. If I was going to eat Thanksgiving dinner alone, I was going to do it somewhere with actual food, with light, with life. I just had to find a way to get through the next hour without falling apart again. I looked at the menu, but the words blurred. I felt a presence beside me. It wasn't the hostess. It was a man, maybe in his early 30s, wearing a flour-dusted apron and carrying a small glass of something steaming. "You look like you've walked 1,000 miles, he said, setting the glass down in front of me. "On the house. Spice cider with a bit of a kick. You need it." I looked up at him, startled by the unexpected kindness. His eyes were steady and kind. "Thank you," I managed to say. "I'm Marcus," he said, leaning against the edge of the empty chair opposite me. "And don't worry. You're not the only one escaping the perfect family drama today. The kitchen is full of us." I took a sip of the cider. It was sweet, sharp, and hit the back of my throat with a warmth that made my eyes prickle. For the first time in 4 days, I felt a tiny, microscopic spark of hope. I didn't have a plan. I just knew I couldn't stay in the silence. I walked out of my apartment and into the biting Chicago wind. The cider was a revelation: cinnamon, clove, and a sharp bite of bourbon that started a slow fire in my chest. Marcus stayed for a moment, his presence grounding. He didn't ask why I was there. He just acted like I was exactly where I was supposed to be. "We're serving a family-style prefix today," Marcus explained, gesturing toward the back of the room. "No menus, no choices. Just what we've been simmering since 5 this morning. You okay with that?" "I'm okay with anything," I said, and I meant it. As he walked back toward the kitchen, I finally looked around. The bistro wasn't full, but it wasn't empty either. At a long table in the center sat an older couple, a younger man with a camera around his neck, and a woman in a vibrant purple head wrap. They were laughing, real, belly-deep laughter, while passing a basket of steaming sourdough bread. The woman at the host stand, the one with the silver hair, approached their table with a bottle of wine. "Eleanor, bring that over here," the older man called out. "Richard is trying to tell us that his sourdough is better than your focaccia again." Eleanor laughed, the sound like wind chimes. She caught my eye and, without missing a beat, pulled a chair out from their table. "Mia, isn't it? I saw your name on your credit card when you set it down." "It's Mia," I stammered, clutching my cider. "Well, Mia, Richard over here is being a bore. And Marcus tells me you're a creative. We need a tiebreaker. Come sit. The fire is nice, but the company is better." My heart did a strange little somersault. My family's table had no room, yet here was a table of strangers literally carving out a space for me. I felt that old instinct to decline, to stay in my flexible, invisible corner so as not to be a burden. But then I thought of the empty chair at my mother's gold and white table. I stood up. I moved my coat. And I sat down between Eleanor and the man with the camera. "I'm Richard," the older man said, extending a hand that was calloused and strong. "I own this place, though Eleanor really runs it. This is our son Daniel," he pointed to the photographer, "and our dear friend Margaret." "I'm just a stray," Margaret joked, her eyes twinkling behind thick glasses. "They found me at a bus stop 10 years ago and haven't been able to shake me since." "She's lying," Eleanor whispered to me, pouring a deep red Pinot Noir into a glass for me. "She's the best cellist in the city, and we had to beg her to come to dinner." For the next 2 hours, the shattering of my morning began to feel like a distant echo. The food was nothing like my mother's curated cold perfection. It was messy and magnificent. There were platters of roasted turkey drizzled in a dark cherry glaze, bowls of smashed potatoes with skins left on, and pools of melted butter. I took the bread. It was warm, the crust shattering perfectly between my teeth. It tasted like safety. As the evening wound down, the kick in the cider and the warmth of the wine began to settle into a comfortable hum. Marcus came out from the kitchen, wiping his hands on his apron, and sat on the arm of Daniel's chair. He caught my eye and winked. "See?" he said. "Better than a quiet night in, right?" "Much better," I said, my voice finally feeling like it belonged to me again. But as I looked at Eleanor and Richard, the way they touched each other's shoulders, the way they looked at Daniel with such unadulterated pride, the old wound twinged. This was a family. A real one. They had a history I wasn't part of. I was just a guest. A stray, as Margaret said. As I prepared to leave, pulling my coat back on and reaching for my purse, Eleanor reached out and touched my arm. "We're doing a tree trimming party next Sunday," she said. It wasn't a casual suggestion. It was an invitation. The bistro will be closed to the public, just us. We always have too much eggnog and Richard sings off-key. "We'd love to see you there, Mia." I looked at her, searching for the hidden catch. The "you're too sensitive," or the "we're actually full." But there was nothing but open, honest warmth in her gaze. "I'd love to come," I whispered. I walked out into the snow, which was now falling in soft, silent flakes. The city didn't feel so empty anymore. I walked past waited the
for him to be the
windows
father
of
I
the
saw
other
in the
houses,
movies,
the one
but
who
I didn't
protects
feel
his
like a
own.
scout in the wilderness.
It's just a busy year. I felt like someone
Mia,
who had
he
just
said
found a
finally,
map.
his voice flat.
I reached my apartment
Devoid
and
of
saw
the
a
warmth
missed
he
call
used
from
for
everyone
everyone
else. I didn't call back.
Your mother has put a lot
I
of
didn't
work
even
into
check
the
the
planning.
voicemail.
I went
Victoria's
to my
in-laws
kitchen,
picked up
well,
the
they're
best
very
dad
formal people.
watch I had kept
It's
in the
important
drawer.
to your sister. One
And
he
what about
never
me,
wore,
Dad?
and is
I
it
placed it in a
important to you
box
that
to
I'm
be
there?
sold online.
I heard him sigh.
I didn't need the reminder
It
of
was
a
a
man
heavy
who chose
burden
silence.
sound.
As
I
if
laid
my
in
very
bed,
existence was
the
a
glow
chore
of
he
the
was
street
tired
lamp
of
filtering
performing through my curtains. For the first time in my life, I wasn't wondering if I was enough. I was wondering what I would bring to the tree trimming party. But as I drifted off to sleep, a small nagging fear crept in. What happens when they find out I'm too much? What happens when the holiday spirit wears off and they realize I'm just a girl with a broken family and a hollow chest? I found myself talking, really talking. I told them I was a graphic designer. I told them about my love for old typography and the way the light hits the Chicago skyline in October. They listened. They didn't interrupt to talk about a sister's pageant or a father's birdhouse. They asked questions. When I mentioned a project I was struggling with, Richard leaned in, genuinely curious about the process. "Creativity is a lonely business, Mia," Richard said, breaking off a piece of sourdough and handing it to me. "You need a village to keep the fire going. Otherwise, you're just shivering in the dark." And roasted carrots that tasted like sunlight and earth. The smell of fresh bread and wood smoke filled the air. The following Sunday, I stood outside, the hearth with a box of homemade ginger cookies and a heart that felt like it was trying to beat its way out of my ribs. The too much fear was a cold weight in my stomach. I was wearing an emerald green sweater, trying to look festive, trying to look like someone who belonged at a tree trimming party instead of someone who spent her Friday nights documenting the different shades of gray on her ceiling. I pushed the door open. The bistro was transformed. The tables had been pushed to the walls, and in the center stood a 12-foot balsam fir that filled the room with the sharp, clean scent of a northern forest. "She's here." Eleanor's voice rang out. She was perched on a stepladder, draped in a string of unlit white lights. She looked like a winter queen. "Richard, get the eggnog." Mia's brought cookies. Within minutes, I was swept into a whirlwind of activity. There was no easing in. Richard handed me a glass of eggnog that was heavy on the nutmeg and even heavier on the rum. Daniel, the photographer, was untangling a massive knot of tinsel, swearing under his breath in a way that made me laugh despite my nerves. And then there was Marcus. He wasn't in his apron today. He was wearing a dark navy flannel, the sleeves pushed up to reveal forearms dusted with fine dark hair. When he saw me, he stepped away from a box of vintage glass ornaments and walked over. "You came," he said, his voice low and warm, cutting through the chaos of the room. "I promised I would," I said, handing him the box of cookies. He took one, bit into it, and closed his eyes. "Mia, if you can design as well as you can bake, I'm going to need you to redo our entire brand identity by Monday." I felt a flush creep up my neck. It wasn't the superficial praise I was used to from Victoria, the kind that always felt like a preamble to a request. It was just appreciation. As the afternoon turned into evening, the healing started in the small, quiet moments. It was the way Eleanor asked me to help her hang the most fragile ornaments, the ones passed down from her grandmother, as if she trusted my hands. It was the way Richard told stories of the bistro's early days, of how they almost went bankrupt 3 times, and how family isn't just who you start with, but who stays when the lights go out. They didn't treat me like a guest. They treated me like a missing piece that had finally been found. At one point, I found myself alone with Eleanor in the small back office, helping her organize the festive menus. The walls were covered in photos, not curated gold and white portraits, but candid shots of messy dinners, tired faces, and people laughing with their mouths full. I went back out to the main room. The tree was lit now, a shimmering tower of gold and silver reflecting in the darkened windows. Marcus was standing by the fireplace watching the flames. I walked over and stood beside him. "Is it always like this?" I asked. "Loud? Messy? Smells like rum?" He smiled. "Yeah, usually." "No," I said, looking at Eleanor and Richard dancing a slow, clumsy shuffle to a jazz record. "Does it always feel this safe?" Marcus turned to me. The firelight caught the amber in his eyes. He reached out, his thumb grazing the back of my hand. A tiny spark of electricity zapped between us, but I didn't pull away. "It does when you find your people," he said. That night, I went home and didn't feel the need to turn on all the lights to ward off the shadows. I felt full, not just from the food and the eggnog, but from the realization that my core wound wasn't a death sentence. It was an opening, but the past wasn't done with me yet. As I checked my phone before bed, I saw a string of messages from Victoria. "Victoria, Mom is hysterical. Dad is barely speaking. How could you not call back? We're family, Mia. You're being so selfish. Ruining the holidays with this silent treatment. Just because you didn't get a seat at one dinner. Grow up." The old Mia would have typed a 3-paragraph apology. The old Mia would have been up all night, heart racing, wondering how to make it right. The new Mia looked at the emerald green sweater draped over the chair, smelling of balsam in the hearth. I didn't reply. I blocked the number. I was learning that you can't build a new house while you're still trying to keep the ruins of the old one from falling on your head. "You have a beautiful family, Eleanor," I said, my voice catching slightly. She stopped and looked at me. She didn't offer a platitude. She walked over and took my hands in hers. Her skin was soft and smelled like lavender and flower. "Mia," she said gently, "we didn't all start together. Daniel is Richard's son from his first marriage. Margaret was a neighbor who had nowhere to go after her husband passed. And Marcus came to us as a line cook with a broken spirit and a lot of talent. We chose each other." She squeezed my hands. "The blood in your veins is just biology. The love in your heart is a choice. And we're choosing you if you'll let us." I felt a tear slip down my cheek. I didn't wipe it away. For the first time, I didn't feel the need to hide my sensitivity. "I don't know how to do this," I whispered. "In my family, love is something you earn by being useful, by being quiet, by being flexible." "Well, here," Eleanor said, pulling a stray thread off my sweater. "We prefer you a little rigid. Stand up for yourself. Take up space. Eat the last cookie. That's how we know you're home." The winter melted into a crisp, hopeful spring, and for the first time in my life, I wasn't waiting for the other shoe to drop. My days were no longer spent navigating the emotional minefield of my mother's moods or my sister's demands. Instead, my life had taken on the rhythm of the hearth. I started doing the design work for the bistro. I spent my afternoons at a corner table, the scratch of my charcoal pencil mingling with the hiss of the espresso machine. Marcus was always there. He'd bring me test subjects, a lemon tart with a perfect zest, a savory galette, or just a cup of coffee exactly the way I liked it. "You're staring at that logo like it's a math problem," Marcus said one Tuesday afternoon, leaning over my shoulder. He smelled like rosemary and sea salt. "It has to be perfect," I murmured, my hand hovering over the sketch of a stylized fireplace. "Eleanor and Richard, they gave me a place. I want to give them an identity that matches what they've built." Marcus pulled out the chair next to me and sat down. He didn't rush me. He just looked at the drawing. "You've already done that, Mia, just by being here. You brought a light into this place that was missing." I looked at him, really looked at him. Marcus was steady. He was the kind of man who didn't fill the room with noise to prove he was there. He just made the room feel better because he was in it. Over the last few months, our friendship had deepened into something that felt like a slow-burning hearth of its own. "I'm not used to people seeing me," I confessed, my voice barely a whisper over the clinking of silverware in the kitchen. In my family, I was the girl in the background, the one who smoothed things over. "Well," Marcus said, reaching out and gently tucking a stray lock of hair behind my ear. His touch was warm, lingering. I don't want you to smooth anything over. I want the sharp edges. I want the whole story. He took me out that night. Not to a fancy restaurant, but to a hidden rooftop garden he knew. We sat on a weathered wooden bench, the Chicago skyline twinkling like a spilled box of diamonds before us. The air was cool, smelling of damp pavement and the first hints of blooming lilac. I've lived here my whole life, I said, looking at the city. But I always felt like a guest, like I was just visiting someone else's life. And now? Marcus asked. He took my hand, his fingers lacing through mine. It wasn't a tentative hold. It was a firm, grounding anchor. Now I feel like I'm finally home, I said. We kissed then, a slow, soft realization that the safety I had found with Eleanor and Richard had a different, deeper version with Marcus. It wasn't the frantic, desperate love I'd seen Victoria perform for her husband. It was quiet. It was sure. It was a choice made every single day. As the weeks turned into months, I became a permanent fixture at the Sunday dinners. I wasn't the extra anymore. I sat at my kitchen table, the letter in my hand. The old Mia would have felt the familiar weight of guilt, that heavy, suffocating blanket that told me their unhappiness was my fault. I could almost taste the bitter coffee of that lonely Thanksgiving. But then I looked at my phone. A text from Marcus. Found a new bakery that does those almond croissants you love. Saved you two. See you at 5? I looked at my father's letter again. Put this behind us. Didn't mean I'm sorry, it meant come back and be our sacrifice. Again. It meant return to the circle so we can feel good about ourselves. I realized that my biological family didn't miss me. They missed the version of me that made their lives easier. They missed the flexible daughter who didn't have needs of her own. I didn't cry this time. I walked to my small fireplace, the one I'd finally learned how to light myself, and I watched the paper curl and turn to ash. The smell of burning paper was sharp and acrid, but as the smoke cleared, I felt a lightness I couldn't explain. I was blossoming. Not because the sun had finally come out, but because I had finally stopped trying to grow in a garden that was salted with my own tears. I was safe. I was loved. And for the first time in 30 years, I was the one holding the pen, writing a story where the ending wasn't a question, but a promise. However, a promise of a new life often requires a legal seal, a permanent boundary that the world can see. And as Marcus and I grew closer, a new daring idea began to form in Eleanor's mind, one that would change the definition of family forever. I was the one who brought the flowers. I was the one who helped Richard with the books. I was the one Eleanor pulled aside to show the vintage lace tablecloth she'd found at an estate sale. This would make a beautiful bridal veil, wouldn't it? She'd said, her I waited eyes for him to be twinkling the with father I knowing saw in the mischief. movies.
I
The
had
one who
laughed it off
protects his
then,
own. But the idea started
it's
to
just
take
a busy
root.
year.
A life
Mia,
where I was
he said
chosen
finally,
first.
his voice flat.
A life where my presence
Devoid of the
wasn't a
warmth
burden
he
to
used
be
for everyone
managed,
else.
but a gift to be celebrated.
Your mother has put a
But
lot of
even
work
in the
into the
blossoming
planning
of this new joy,
Victoria's
the
in-laws
shadows
are,
of the past tried to
well,
reach
they're
out.
very formal people.
I began to receive letters.
It's important to your sister.
Actual handwritten
And what
letters
about
from
me,
my
Dad?
father.
Is it
Mia,
important
your mother
to you
is
that I'm
unwell.
there?
The
I
stress
heard
of
him
your
sigh.
absence is taking a toll
It was a
on her.
heavy burden sound.
She doesn't understand why
As
you've
if my
walked
very
away from
existence
your own
was a
blood.
chore he was tired of performing.
We miss you at the table. Please just come for a weekend. Let's put this behind us. The idea didn't start with a grand gesture. It started with a cup of chamomile tea and a rainy Tuesday afternoon in Eleanor's private kitchen above the bistro. The air smelled of dried herbs and the faint, sweet scent of the beeswax candles Eleanor kept lit in every room. I had been telling her about the letters from my father. The way they felt like hooks trying to drag me back under a dark water. I had finally escaped. They treat me like a runaway piece of furniture, I said, my voice shaking as I watched the steam curl from my mug. Like I'm an asset they've misplaced. Eleanor sat across from me, her silver hair catching the soft light. She didn't look away. She didn't offer a shallow, "It'll get better." She reached across the table and covered my hand with hers. "Mia," she said, her voice steady and intentional. "Richard and I have been talking. We've spent our lives building this place. And we've spent our lives choosing our family. But there's a difference between choosing someone in your heart and choosing them in the eyes of the world." I looked up confused. "What do you mean?" "I mean," she continued, a small, nervous smile playing on her lips, "that I am 64 years old, and I have never met a soul I wanted to call daughter more than you. We know you're an adult. We know you have your own life. But we want to make it official. We want to pursue an adult adoption. The word hit me like a physical weight. Adoption. You want to adopt me? I whispered. We want you to have our name, Richard said, stepping into the kitchen. He had a smudge of flour on his cheek and a look of fierce, quiet protection in his eyes. We want you to be our legal next of kin. We want the world to know that if you ever need a place to land, if you ever need a person to call in the middle of the night, it's us. Legally, permanently, forever. I felt the air leave my lungs. For 30 years, I had begged for a crumb of acknowledgement from the people who shared my DNA. I had performed, shrunk, and apologized just to be tolerated. And here were two people who had known me for less than a year, offering to sign a document that said, "She is ours." I didn't answer with words. I just leaned forward and let the tears come. Not the tears of a girl who was being discarded, but the tears of a woman who was finally being claimed. The months that followed were a blur of legal paperwork and joyful planning. Adult adoption was a strange, beautiful process. It felt like we were rewriting my birth certificate with a pen dipped in gold. Every time I saw the name Eleanor and Richard on a legal document next to mine, I felt a layer of the old armor fall away. At the same time, Marcus and I were planning our own beginning. But as the date approached, a lingering fear began to itch at the back of my mind. It was the fear of the uninvited. My biological family had gone silent after. I stopped responding to the letters, but silence from my mother was never peaceful. It was usually the eye of the storm. I spent my evenings sewing my own veil, using the vintage lace Eleanor had given me. The sound of the needle, piercing the delicate fabric, was meditative. Stitch, I am chosen. Stitch, I am loved. Stitch, I am home. 1 week before the wedding, I received a package. No return address, but I knew the handwriting. It was a box from my mother. I opened it with trembling hands. Inside was a dress, a white, gaudy, sequined thing that Victoria had worn to a gala 3 years ago. There was a note pinned to the strap. Since you've decided to play house with strangers, I thought you might need something decent to wear. It's a bit big for you, but you've always been good at making do. We'll see you Saturday. We're coming to bring you home, Mia. Enough is enough. The making do hit me like a slap. The bring you home felt like a threat. I looked at the dress. It smelled like my mother's perfume, heavy, floral, and suffocating. For a second, I felt that old urge to shrink. I felt the shadow of the little girl who didn't want to cause trouble. But then I felt a hand on my shoulder. It was Richard. He had come over to help me move some boxes. He looked at the dress, then at the note, and then at me. You don't have to let them in, Mia, he said, his voice like iron. The door to this family is only open to those who love the person inside. You are not a piece of property to be brought home. You are home. I looked at the sequins. I looked at the heavy, ugly fabric of a life I no longer lived. I walked to the kitchen and grabbed a pair of fabric shears. With one clean, sharp motion, I cut the note in half. Then I put the dress back in the box, taped it shut, and wrote "refused" in bold, black ink across the front. I was no longer flexible. I was no longer the acceptable sacrifice. I was a daughter of the hearth. I was the wife of Marcus. And I was finally, legally, and spiritually my own woman. But as the sun rose on my wedding day, the air felt charged. The scent of lilies and wood smoke filled the bistro, and the light was golden and perfect. I stood in my room looking at the reflection of a woman in a simple, elegant silk gown with a lace veil that told a story of chosen love. I knew they were coming. I could feel it in the wind. But for the first time in my life, I wasn't afraid of the storm. I was the one holding the lightning. Let's do it at the bistro, Marcus said one night as we sat on the floor of my apartment, surrounded by fabric samples and sketches. Where we met. Where the fire was. And the cider? I laughed, leaning my head on his shoulder. And the girl who looked like she'd walked 1,000 miles, he whispered, kissing the top of my head. We decided on a small ceremony. Just the village. Just the people who had kept the fire going. We'd do the adoption finalization in the morning at the courthouse. And the wedding in the evening at the hearth, the morning, was a quiet masterpiece. At the courthouse, the judge had smiled as he signed the final decree. For the state of Illinois, I was now officially the daughter of Eleanor and Richard. I had walked out of that building feeling like I was finally weighted to the earth, no longer a stray leaf blown by the whims of people who didn't want me. By 6 p.m., the hearth was a sanctuary of amber light, and the scent of rosemary-infused champagne. The tables were draped in deep forest green. and the fireplace crackled, casting a warm, protective glow over the 50 people gathered there. My village. I stood at the back of the room, my hand tucked into the crook of Richard's arm. He looked grand in his charcoal suit, his eyes misting every time he looked at me. "Ready?" he whispered. "Ready," I said. The music, a soft, soulful cello piece played by Margaret, began to swell. We started down the narrow aisle, past faces that looked at me with genuine, uncomplicated joy. Marcus stood at the front, looking steady and breathtaking. His eyes locked on mine as if I were the only light in the room. But then the heavy oak front door of the bistro swung open with a bang that echoed like a gunshot. The music faltered. The room went cold. There, framed by the twilight and the swirling Chicago snow, stood my biological family. My mother, Diane, in a fur coat that looked like armor. My father, David, looking small and uncomfortable behind her. And Victoria, holding a phone up as if she were documenting a crime scene. The silence was suffocating. I could smell the cold air they'd brought in, cutting through the scent of my lilies. "Well," Diane's voice rang out, sharp and brittle. "I see we weren't lying about the strangers. What a quaint little performance, Mia." She began to walk down the aisle, her heels clicking aggressively on the hardwood. My heart started to gallop, the old instinct to hide, to apologize, to make it stop, screaming in my ears. I felt myself shrinking until I felt Richard's arm tighten. He didn't move. He stood like an ancient oak. "That's far enough, Diane," Richard said. His voice wasn't loud, but it had a vibration that made the glass ornaments on the nearby table hum. "Get out of our way!" Victoria snapped, stepping forward. "We're here to talk to our sister." "Mia, stop this. You've had your little tantrum. You've made your point. Now put on the dress Mom sent you and let's go. We have a reservation at the club." I looked at them. I looked at the mother, who had told me there was no room. I had looked at the father who had chosen a birdhouse over my heart. "Blood is just biology, Dad," I said. And for the first time, I looked him right in the eye. "You had 30 years to be my father. You had 30 years to defend me, to choose me, to pull up a chair for me. You didn't. You chose silence. You chose her. And now, I am choosing the people who chose me when I had nothing to give them but my grief." Diane laughed, a hollow, bitter sound. "These people don't love you. They're using you for your work, for your creativity. When they get bored of your moods, they'll cast you out just like everyone else does." "No," a new voice said. Marcus stepped down from the altar. He walked to my side and took my hand. His touch was like a shield. "We didn't find Mia and decide to use her. We found a woman who had been starved of the love she deserved. And we decided to build a world where she'd never be hungry again. You're not here because you love her. You're here because you lost control of her." He looked at my father. "The door is behind you. Use it or I'll call the police. This is a private event for family only. And you don't qualify." Victoria looked around the room, her face twisting in disgust as she saw the people, the strays, the line cooks, the neighbors looking at her with pity. "Fine, stay with your losers. Stay in your little bistro. Just don't come crying to us when you realize what you've thrown away." "I'm not throwing anything away, Victoria," I said, my voice finally calm, finally clear. "I'm finally taking the trash out." They turned. They walked out. The door shut with a heavy final thud. The silence that followed was different. It wasn't the heavy, terrified silence of my childhood. It was the silence after a fever breaks. It was the sound of a vacuum being filled with light. Margaret picked up her bow. The cello began to sing again, a melody that sounded like a homecoming. I looked at Eleanor, who was standing by the fireplace with tears streaming down her face. I looked at Richard, who squeezed my hand one last time before handing me to Marcus. I didn't look at the door. I didn't look back at the shadows. I looked at the man in front of me, at the parents who had adopted a 30-year-old woman because they believed she was worth claiming, and I smiled. The ceremony continued. I said my vows. I took the ring, and as the champagne was poured and the laughter returned to the room, I realized that the shattering hadn't been an end at all. It had been the sound of the shell breaking so the bird could finally fly. I looked at the sister who saw my life as a tantrum. I stepped out from behind Richard. I stood in the center of the aisle, my white silk dress shimmering in the firelight. My hands were trembling, but my voice was a blade. I am not going anywhere," I said. "Mia, don't be ridiculous," my mother said, reaching out to grab my wrist. Her hand was cold, smelling of expensive cream and resentment. "You're making a scene." Think of the family name.
I pulled my arm back. Which name, Diane?
Because this morning I changed mine. I am a daughter of this house now, legally, spiritually, entirely. My father finally spoke, his voice cracking. Mia, you can't just replace us. We're your blood. The weeks following, the wedding felt like the first deep breath after a lifetime of underwater swimming. The confrontation at the hearth hadn't left me shaken. It had left me cauterized. The old wounds were still there, but they were finally, officially scars. Life took on a new, beautiful density. I moved my things into the apartment. Above the bistro with Marcus, a space that smelled of his rosemary, focaccia, and my vanilla candles. We spent our mornings in the quiet hum of the kitchen before the lunch rush, sharing a single pastry and mapping out our future on flour-dusted napkins. A month after the wedding, a thick manila envelope arrived in the mail. No return address, but I knew the weight of it. It was from my father. I sat at the small bistro table by the window, the spring sun warming my shoulders, and opened it. Inside were 3 things: a legal document, a stack of old yellowed letters, and a small velvet box. The document was a copy of my father's will. He had removed the flexible clauses, the ones that favored Victoria's children, and left his entire personal workshop and his modest inheritance to me. The letters were ones I had written to him from summer camp when I was 10, letters I thought he'd thrown away. And the box contained my grandmother's locket, the one my mother had always said was lost. There was a note scribbled on a piece of scrapwood paper. You were right, Mia. I chose silence because I was a coward. I kept these things hidden because it was the only way. I knew how to hold on to you without making her angry. It wasn't enough. It was never enough. I'm sorry I didn't know how to be the father you needed until it was too late to be your father at all. Use the inheritance to build something that is yours. Truly yours. I didn't cry for him. I felt a quiet, hollow sadness for the man he was, but the grip he had on my heart had finally loosened. I realized that closure isn't a conversation. It's a realization that you no longer need the other person to understand your pain for it to be valid. I took the locket and the letters to Eleanor. We sat in her garden, the first tulips poking their heads through the soil. What do I do with this? I asked, showing her the locket. Eleanor polished the silver with the hem of her apron. You keep it as a reminder, Mia, not of the family you lost, but of the woman you became to survive them. And then, she smiled, you pass it on to someone who will never have to wonder if they have a seat at the table. That was the moment the morning sickness started. It was a tiny, fluttering realization, a shift in the internal tides. 2 weeks later, a plastic stick confirmed what my heart already knew. I was pregnant. The fear hit me first. What if I'm like her? What if the too muchness is hereditary? What if I don't know how to love a child without making them a sacrifice? I was standing in the kitchen, staring at the positive test, when Richard walked in to check the sourdough starter. He saw my face, saw the stick on the counter, and let out a roar of joy that probably shook the wine glasses in the cellar. A grandchild? He bellowed, pulling me into a hug that smelled of cedar and yeast. Eleanor, Marcus! Get in here! Marcus ran in, his hands covered in dough. And when he saw me, he didn't ask if I was ready or if we could afford it. He just picked me up and spun me around, his face buried in the crook of my neck. We're going to be okay, he whispered. We're going to be more than okay. As my belly grew, so did my sense of peace. I spent my afternoons designing a new wing for the hearth, a sunroom filled with plants and books, a place for people to sit and stay as long as they needed. I used my father's inheritance to fund it. I called it the daughter's room. I started writing letters of my own, not to the past but to the future. I wrote to the little girl growing inside me. I told her about the grandmother who made the best eggnog in Chicago. I told her about the grandfather who built the strongest tables. I told her about the father who chose her mother first, every single day. One evening, as I was sitting in the nearly finished sunroom, I felt the baby kick for the first time. It was a sharp, clear movement, a tiny, I'm here. I looked out the window at the city. The lights were flickering on, a million little circles of belonging. I thought about the girl who had sat on the floor of a dark apartment 3 years ago, staring at a bag of wasted cranberries. That girl was gone. In her place was a woman who knew exactly how much space she took up. A woman who was legally, emotionally, and fiercely claimed. I picked up my pen and wrote the final entry in my journal. I used to think family was a circle you were born into. Now I know it's a table you build yourself. And there is always, always enough room. The sunroom was finally finished. The glass walls reflected the vibrant greens of a Chicago summer, and the air inside was still and sweet, smelling of fresh paint and the lavender sprigs Eleanor had tucked into the cushions. I sat in a rocking chair, my hand resting on the swell of my stomach. My daughter, we decided to name her Ruth, after the woman who saw me when I was invisible, was due in 3 weeks. Sometimes I still catch myself looking at the door, waiting for a storm to blow in. I still have moments where I wonder if I'm taking up too much air. But then I hear the clatter of the lunch rush downstairs. I hear Richard's booming laugh as he jokes with a regular. I hear Marcus humming a jazz tune while he preps the evening specials. The shattering was a long time ago. Now I am a mosaic. I am made of the pieces that were broken, but I have been put back together with gold. I looked at my hands. They were steady. They didn't shake anymore when the phone rang. I had realized that the greatest victory wasn't the confrontation at the wedding. It was the quiet life I had built in the aftermath. It was the fact that I no longer needed their permission to exist. I leaned back, watching a sparrow land on the windowsill outside. It pecked at the wood, looking for a place to nest. I smiled, thinking of my father's birdhouses. I had forgiven him, in the way you forgive a tree for not being a house. It did its best with the roots it had. But I was no longer a bird looking for a place to land. I was the house. I turned to the last page of my sketchbook. I didn't draw a logo or a plan. I wrote a message for me, for Ruth, and for anyone else who might ever find themselves sitting in this sunroom, feeling like a guest in their own life. You are not a backup plan. You are the main event. As the light began to fade into a soft violet dusk, I felt a familiar warmth. Marcus stepped into the room, 2 mugs of decaf tea in his hands. He didn't say anything. He just sat on the ottoman at my feet and rested his head against my knee. In the quiet, I realized that I had finally found the secret to the perfect circle. It wasn't about keeping people out. It was about making the circle big enough to hold every stray, every wanderer, and every girl who had ever been told there wasn't enough room. I am Mia. I am a daughter, a wife, a mother, and a creator. And I am finally beautifully home. If you're watching this and you've been the scapegoat of your family, if you've been told you're too much or too sensitive, or always causing drama just because you dared to ask to be treated fairly, I want you to know something. It's not you. It never was. You deserve to be chosen. Not as a backup, not as a last resort, not as the acceptable sacrifice when someone else's comfort is at stake. Chosen first. Chosen fully. Chosen without conditions. Family isn't blood. Family isn't obligation. Family isn't people who share your DNA but treat you like a burden. Family is the people who show up. The people who see you crying alone and invite you to their table. The people who open their hearts and their homes and make you officially, permanently, undeniably theirs. I spent 30 years trying to earn love from people who were never going to give it. And then I spent 3 years learning what love actually looks like. If this story touched you, please take a moment to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell. It helps more people find these stories when they need them most. I want to hear from you. Have you ever had to set boundaries with your own family? Share your experience in the comments. I read every single one. Tell me where you're watching from and what time it is there. I love knowing how far this story reaches. And if you want more stories like this, check the description. I've linked some of my favorites there. Until next time, remember, you deserve to be chosen,